Okay, we're moving on to our first of the fundamental sources of inequality and problems in American society and perhaps globally, social problems around class and poverty. So in these videos, we're going to be looking at why social class is so important in our society, uh, what makes a capitalist society capitalist, defining class, and looking at class inequality and poverty today. Just this weekend, there was a New York Times op-ed about, well, it was an op-ed, it was about a Marxist scholar who insisted on talking about race instead of class. And this is a fairly old discussion in academic circles. What's more important? Which one is more defining today? We're not going to necessarily answer that question in these videos, but it's something we'll revisit as we move throughout the course. But let's think about why class is so important to so many people. So let's think about these two ways of getting lettuce. One, we have lettuce growing in a raised bed, perhaps in a yard somewhere. The other, lettuce on a shelf. What's the difference between these? Money. Now, of course, the raised bed might take some money to put together, and firms privately own seeds to many plants today. But when we want to think about why class is so important, economic class, we need to realize the fact that almost everything we get in our society is based on a market. And what that means is not that we, go to a supermarket necessarily, though often we do, but that we buy everything we need. Everything. There is very little we get that we don't have to buy. Water, shelter, education. You can even buy, well, a close approximation to someone telling you they love you and perhaps showing it out in bed. So everything is on the market in our society. And that's why social class becomes so important, because money, which is ultimately the basis of class that we're looking at, acts as this kind of barrier between us and everything we need. Now, it's important to realize that society wasn't really always like this. Prior to, let's say, the 1600s, and really from the 16 through 1800s, societies around the world, not just Western societies and European societies, were organized in a kind of feudal system, or a feudal mode of production. We'll come back to that phrase. It was very different from today. Most people who were working, so if we're thinking about labor, were working in agriculture, meaning they were farming. They plowed, they raised animals, they raised most of the food they need. So when they worked every day and they made stuff, it was for subsistence. Subsistence meaning to exist, to subsist, to continue on. So when people made stuff and worked, they labored for subsistence. Now, sure, they did some work that was for the fancy people up in the castles, um, but by and large, most people just produced to make what they need on a daily basis, and when they were done, they quit. Society was organized around household by and large. If you think back to, if you watched Game of Thrones or any of these old um, shows about feudal societies, family is really the key organizing factor. When a king dies, it's the son or the wife or the next person in the family who steps up and rules the country. And really, the entire country would often be organized around this household. Key people were often siblings, brothers, sisters, or loyalists. Um, and if there was a key rival to the king, it was usually the church. The church had a lot of land and had a lot of respect and authority in the people's eyes. And indeed, usually, if you have an emperor or a king, their legitimacy came through the church. The emperor of Japan was said to have been a tear from the left eye of a goddess, for example. Um, Most people met their needs through farming in small markets, but nothing like we see today. It's something like we actually think of when we talk about markets. Um, all of this is totally different from today. In capitalism, So if we think about um, feudalism, when people worked, they worked to make the stuff they needed. You know, I'm going to go make a shoe and make some lettuce. But today we work for a wage, right? Wage labor. And then we use that wage to get those things we need: computers, money, ice cream, jeans, though apparently no one's wearing jeans anymore because we're all getting fat in the pandemic. Um, it's cool, no shame. And when we produce things, we're not making stuff for our individual needs. If I go to work in a pencil factory, I'm not making 1,000 pencils because I need them. I'm making those for someone else who owns the factory, for one thing, but also because that person wants to sell them or exchange them. So that person isn't, they do have to make something that people need, but the goal of making stuff is to produce things to exchange in a market and ideally to make a profit, right? To get back more money than they sunk into making pencils. Now, unlike the societies that were primarily organized around households, particularly the king's household who kind of ran the land, our society is organized primarily around markets. This is particularly the case in the US. So pretty much everything we need is bought and sold in the market. We're not given housing by the king. Um, we have to go find housing on a housing market. I'm dealing with this process right now. Um, Everything we need is on the market. And most of our lives is organized around markets. You want to get healthcare, you have to go buy it. You want to get a computer, you have to go buy it. You want to get an education, go buy it. Some things we'll see are off the market or decommodified. And that's the key thing that makes the difference between a pair of mittens that your grandmother knits and the pair you buy, is that a commodity is produced for exchange and for profit. So this is a very different way of organizing society, right? A different mode of production. So what we're looking at is a couple different things here. One is class structure. These are the fundamental classes, and this is from a particularly Marxian point of view. For those of you who may have heard Marx only in the lips of Republicans who are trying to sow fear, Marx is still taken very seriously in academic circles. So in feudalism, you had the feudal lord. This was the person who had the right to the land. They didn't actually own it. That land was a kind of donated or given to them for favor by the king who technically had the right to the land. So property is actually familial in this instance. And the peasant or small farmer was the one who worked the land for that lord. And essentially what they would do is produce a little extra crop for that feudal lord. Again, this isn't just someone who has the right to the land. And as long as they made enough for that lord, they would let them stay on the land. And that's how people kind of did their thing. So the key means of production, the key means of making what we need, well, the land was owned technically by the lord, at the end by the king. Again, it's more of a right. But the peasants often owned their own tools for farming and might have owned their own animals as well. And again, you had some specialized tools for people who made things like carts and luxury goods. But by and large, peasants were allowed to work the land. And this is still true in many parts of the world. Places like India and China, there are still people who simply work free land to make what they need on a daily basis. They're still very agrarian countries. The form of work is for subsistence. As we've already talked about, the form of production is for need and subsistence and maybe luxury. We contrast this with capitalism, where capitalists who own and control businesses employ workers. Now, that business is the private property of the capitalist. And we have the private property that is our labor or our labor power. Now, if we think back to the feudal example, the peasant was only allowed to stay on the land because they made a little extra corn and lettuce and, I don't know, meat for the person who had the actual right to the land, that feudal lord. That doesn't seem to be the case here. There's not that same kind of relationship of personal dependence. Um, the lord would also protect the peasant from people raiding their farm, for example. It was kind of a personalistic relationship. Today, we seem to be free to go work for whomever we want, but anyone who's been on the job market knows that that's not always the case, particularly when the job market is bad. Um, but also, capitalists need workers to produce that profit. Right? So production is done for profit and accumulation. They want to accumulate wealth. If a business isn't profitable, if it isn't growing, then the business is failing. Right? So the capitalist owns the factory, owns all the stuff to make the uh, pencils we talked about, right? So the capitalist owns the means of production. The worker only owns their own labor power. I sell that to the capitalist, I make pencils for them, and from this point of view, I sort of do the same thing that the peasant does. I'm producing more pencils than the value of my labor. So if I'm making $15 an hour, if the capitalist is going to profit, I have to make more than $15 worth of pencils in that hour. I have to make 16, 17, 18. Now, this is the same thing in the feudal situation. If the lord is going to do well, I need to make more stuff for them. This is what we call exploitation. It's not a moral term. It means that if the person who owns those means of production is going to do well or do better, I need to make more for them. For the feudal lord, this often came in just squeezing the peasants more, asking them for more of their crops. Go watch any Akira Kurosawa movie and you'll see these starving, miserable-looking peasants who are vaguely harassed by bandits and somewhat protected by the samurai class, the knights, who would have had rights to land and such. Those miserable peasants are often miserable because they're being squeezed so hard, and it's very clear who's doing it. Today, we might have a very different relationship. We might have to check our email when we get home from work. We might have to hit productivity numbers. If you've ever worked as a cashier, you know exactly what this means because they will often bring you numbers and tell you to get your numbers up. They want you to get your numbers up because the harder you work, the more productive you are, the more profit they make. So we're going to be exploring the implications of this kind of class relationship throughout the next few videos, though we'll also look at a different way of thinking about class. Both can be useful, but we'll also think about what might be a post-capitalist society. What is socialism? And how does it relate to these 5 different aspects of a mode of production? We'll talk about that more in our class time.